All right. Welcome to Lost River Church of Christ. Good to see everybody out this evening. Tonight we're going to be in the book of, we're going to be in John. We've been studying John. We're coming close to the end of John. And we're going to be looking in John chapter 18 tonight. John chapter 18. I've gone off and ran off without my notes, so I will be as surprised as any of you as to what shows up there, because I don't know. So I'm just glad it's up there. So a couple things before we get started and before we say a prayer tonight. You know, obviously we had the bad weather that has altered our class schedule. Fortunately, I had built in some snow days at the very end, which was good. So we're able to kind of keep. We were able to drop one class, topical class, and keep this. So tonight we'll do chapter 18. We'll do a couple classes on the resurrection. So we'll get as far as we get on Sunday, and then we'll pick up the rest of 19, and then we'll do a class on chapter 20, a class on chapter 21, and we'll still have an opportunity for a conclusion. So that's how the rest of the trimester is going to pan out. For those of you who are curious how that was going to pan out. One thing I want to say before, and I'm doing this intentionally before we say a prayer for our class tonight, but I wanted to pick up with a question that Jared had ended the last class with, that he had mentioned specifically, and I thought it was a good takeaway for all of us to think about and talk about before we go to God in prayer. And from the end of the last class, Jared had asked, how do we see the glory of Jesus, particularly mentioned in John chapter 17, verse 24? And I'll read it over there again. And obviously, Jesus in this prayer, he says, Father, I desire that they also, whom you gave me, may be with me where I am, that they may behold my glory, which you have given me. For you loved me before the foundation of the world. And so the question is, and the question that Jared had asked right at the very end of the last class is, how do we, this is obviously coming in the particular section of the prayer. This is obviously true for the apostles in a very specific way, because they're going to see the risen Jesus not that many days from now. But he puts this at the end, particularly as it relates to, and those who would believe upon the apostles' word. So at some fundamental level, Jesus prayed for you to be able to see his glory. That is his wish for you, is for you to see his glory. And I wanted to bring this up because this is a very important part of the book. This is one of the more fundamental things that we've talked about. One of these topics that we've talked about that has come up over and over again in the book of John is the idea about seeing versus not seeing, being blind versus seeing, light, dark. The whole concept of the book is around this idea of, do you see Jesus for what Jesus truly is? And tonight we're going to talk about people who don't see Jesus who do not see his glory the way that his glory truly is. And that's going to be filtered all through chapter 18 and through the rest of the book, no doubt, is seeing the glory of Jesus from here to the end of the book. And when Jared brought that up, obviously at the end of this last class, there was a particular passage in mind that came to my mind that the more I looked at it, the more I recognized how much it has in common with the aspects of the book of John that we've been looking at. And if you'll turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 3, maybe your mind went there too. 2 Corinthians chapter 3 answers this question somewhat for us in how we see the glory of Jesus. And the immediate verse that I thought of is, of course, in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18. But the more I examined the immediate context, you'll see how many of the different key words that we've talked about in the book of John, Paul uses in this context. Look up in there, and I've written some of these out. You know, look over there in verse 6, where it talks about the Spirit of God, where it says, he's made us sufficient as ministers of a new covenant, not according to the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And then obviously, so the idea of the Spirit and life that's been given there. And then in 4:6, even after this comment, is God who commanded light to shine out of darkness, who has shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. And then the particular passage that I wanted to hone in on in answering to this question, we all with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as by the Spirit of the Lord. And then going down quickly to chapter 4, verse 16, we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. We do not look at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. And so this idea, this concept, how do we see the glory of Christ? Because we look at the things that are not seen. We behold him in a way that others do not behold him. We look at him in a way that others don't. And we look at him in the way that we each live our lives, and in the way we look into the law, and we look into the Spirit and what has been revealed to us here, and we see the face of Jesus. And when we look into that, we are transformed just by beholding his glory. We are made more glorious. And of course, 17, verse 24, anticipates the way in which this is fully revealed, obviously, in the church in the most ultimate sense, in the presence of Christ. John writes there at the very end. So fast forward to the very end of the Bible. When Jesus prays that they would see my glory in this totality, when Paul says we're all beholding the glory of the Lord, it anticipates this at the very end in Revelation chapter 21. But I saw no temple in it, for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. The city had no need of the sun or of the moon to shine in it, for the glory of God illuminated it. The Lamb is its light. And the nations are those who are saved shall walk in its light, and the kings of earth shall bring their glory and honor into it. Its gates shall not be shut at all by day. There will be no night there. And with that having said, I'd like to go to God in word of prayer for us, asking him to show us the glory of his Son and bless our study tonight. Our great and heavenly Father, we come before you so humbled at the opportunity we have to look at your scriptures, to look at your word, to see the face of Jesus there, to see your great love and sacrifice for us, but to see that that is the most glorious moment for your Son. The point in which he was glorified, the hour that he had come to, we've now come to ourselves in our own study this semester, and ask that you would bless our study and our time looking at it, that we may be glorified by beholding him, and that we may be transformed into increasing levels of glory as we become more and more familiar with your word and your Son. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. So with that, having said that, let's jump right in John chapter 18. John chapter 18. And I'm going to go ahead and read verses 1 through 11 for us here. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden which he and his disciples entered. And Judas, who had betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, "Whom are you seeking?" And they answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas, who betrayed them, also stood with them. Now when he said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Then he asked them again, "Whom are you seeking?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus answered, "I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way. That the saying might be fulfilled which he spoke, of those whom you gave me, I have lost none." Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into the sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me?" All right, so a few things in this very interesting. So obviously now we've been several chapters in the upper room, and now we're leaving the upper room, and we're going across Brook Kidron into the Garden of Gethsemane. And the Garden of Gethsemane and the Brook Kidron, which I'm going to show you some pictures of here in just a sec to kind of illuminate where we're talking about. But Gethsemane, the name Gethsemane is the place of the olive press. And so, not surprisingly, it is found on the foothills of the Mount of Olives. So obviously the olive press, it's down at the bottom near the foothills, nearest the temple and nearest the actual Jerusalem proper. It's called the place of the olive press there, so you could take your olives, have it there. And there's a garden that's there, and there's this Kidron there, and it's a wadi. It's not really it's not a a full year-round flowing river. Instead, it's a deep valley that's immediately between two mountains, and you're about to see this in a second. So the Temple Mount rises on one side, and the Mount of Olives rises adjacent on the other side, and the valley in between them is the Kidron Valley, and there's wadi flows in there, and it'd be dry during the summer months, and during the rainy seasons, you would really get some water going in through there. This is the area around Jerusalem where we are. Here's some pictures. So this is the particularly lush area of the Kidron Valley. You can't really tell where the water would be from this photo, but obviously you're looking up at the Temple Mount right there in Jerusalem proper in this. So this is kind of that nice fertile area that's right outside. This picture really gives you more an idea of where we're talking about and where water might flow through there. So you see the extreme difference in elevation. So Jesus leaves from on the one side, the Temple Mount, that's the Jerusalem area, would have come all the way down that hill, crossed over the Kidron Valley in that brook area, and then would have gone up to the foothills of that Mount of Olives area right there. And so this is looking back up at a different perspective on that same brook, on that same Kidron Valley. And this, of course, just shows, obviously, where we're talking about. So that's where the Garden of Gethsemane is. Obviously, we don't know exactly where the upper room was, but you can kind of see it's close in sight line, but obviously it's pretty far because you've got to go pretty far down and pretty far back up. So it was a good little walk, obviously, that night on the eastern side of the city there, going towards Bethany, where Lazarus and Mary and Martha were from. This here is a picture of the Garden of Gethsemane with all the olive trees. Some of the olive trees there are thought to be as old as, the ones that are there are thought to be as old as the time of Christ. So perhaps some of the exact olive trees you were seeing there were the olive trees that were around when Jesus was actually present in this garden praying there. And some of you probably have been to this location and have seen some of these exact trees. So just some interesting, so that gives you some kind of idea of the lay of the land and exactly where we are. One of the interesting things you'll notice back in verse 2 is that it says Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. And you'll recall the last time we saw Judas, he just got up and left in the middle of dinner. Everybody remember that a few chapters ago? And there's not really any indication that he knew where they were going. But it seems obvious that they had been here, and this must have been some type of rallying point or some kind of point in which they would often regroup. And there were many times, obviously, where Jesus and his followers you can just think about the logistics of 12 men that got different duties, they're going different places, they need a central place to meet. So obviously this is a place, and as John writes here, they'd been to many times before. And so Judas knew potentially where Jesus was going. So he's obviously responsible for leading this detachment of soldiers to come get Jesus. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time, by the way, dealing with the other accounts. There's all kinds of things we're going to leave out because we're focusing on John, not so much the other Gospels. And if I tried to give you the chronological, it would take all night. So in this particular case, we're going to focus just on Judas and leading the detachment of soldiers there. And I really, really like the wording in verse 4 again, particularly in the New King James. Some of your versions may say something a little bit different. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward. He knew all that was coming upon him, and he still chose to move forward. And one of the things that we've said about whose hour is this? John has repeatedly positioned it this way. Whose hour is this? This is my hour. This is Jesus's hour. He owns this hour. This is the hour of his glorification. And this verse kind of backs up the assertion that we've been making time and time again. Everything about his death, from this moment on, Jesus may not appear to be physically in control, but make no mistake, Jesus is absolutely in control of everything and how it's going to go down and when it's going to go down and where it's going to go down. He chose, this is my hour. And so he chose this, and knowing all the things that were going to happen to him. And we, of course, are intimately familiar with his prayer in the garden and with that John does not record, but in all those things, he knew intimately that all the things that were about to happen to him, and yet he went forward with the tremendous amount of courage, the tremendous amount of concern. It's just hard to even imagine the attitude, and John doesn't spend a lot of time dealing with that here, but these simple words suffice that knowing all that he would know that would come to pass, he went forward anyways. Yeah. As he's repeatedly kind of said in these upper room teaching, my hour has come to pass. And so I do mean that this is the point. This is the center. Now we've come to the crux of the issue. And to that point, we've come to the crux of all human history. I mean, this is where it all comes down to. This is the point in time where everything hangs in the balance. They call a period where the game is going to be decided, and they call it sudden death. This right here is the point in which all creation, the outcome of all cosmic history, man's redemption, hangs in the balance on this spot in time. So we can't understate the importance, obviously, of what happens here. And then we have this very interesting, so to further kind of comment on how much Jesus controlled what was going on, we have this reference to when they come out and they say, who we're looking for, and they said, Jesus of Nazareth, and he says, ego in me, which is the Greek for I am. And back when we talked about the 7 I am statements of John, this was thrown in as the 8th statement. And it truly is kind of the 8th statement. This is the 8th statement. And interestingly enough, when he says it, what does everybody do? They fall down. They fall down on one knee. And I would tend to think this is a miraculous event. Previously, when man had encountered God on all occasions, before Jesus came in the flesh, when man encountered God, what typically happened? They bowed down. They fell down occasionally like dead men, right? Every time you can think of every time the angel of the Lord showed up previously, God showed up in any type of format, a terrible angel, they fell down. And in this case, when Jesus, and to me, this is thrown in here to further show the authority that Jesus had on the situation, so that no one who's reading the Gospel of John could at all be confused about the nature of who's in control here. Jesus is the one that's actually in control. And he just declares the name, I am, and they hit the deck, just like any other man would hit the deck. Because it's the reality of who he is. He's expressing something that to get them to see who they've truly come out to arrest. And the other really interesting thing about this is that they're not deterred by that in this particular case. That they continue to go on with obviously he says these words, everybody in the crowd, it's obviously a large number of people. I don't know exactly what this looked like, but I've never seen 100 people fall down at the same time. I don't know what that would have looked like. But obviously it would have been a big kerfuffle that all these people fell down at the same time at the mere mention of who he was. So he declares I am, and truly for the 8th time here, he is the I am in the book of John. And we see that his primary concern at this point is to physically protect the disciples that were with him. And John mentions here in verse 9, of those whom you gave me, I've lost none. The reference back to John chapter 6, verse 39, which we talked about some time ago. And we thought about that primarily in relation to its spiritual significance, which it is. But in this case, John here uses it, it's particularly in reference to his disciples, because in normal scenarios, what would you expect to happen here? Jesus is here with his 12 disciples, and out comes this detachment. What would you normally think would happen? What would normally have happened? Yeah, they'd all be round up, right? The idea that so if this was anybody else who was coming out to be arrested, and he had these group of guys that were constantly with him, kind of as his assembly, his bodyguard, his servants, normally they would have taken all of them. But in this, Jesus, through his words here, convinces them to not take these men. And so he's immediately concerned for his disciples. But in spite of that, what does Peter do? Peter. Yeah, he cuts off an ear. So, as soon as Jesus is like, you want me, let them go, Peter does exactly what you would think Peter would do. He draws out a sword, he swipes for somebody's head, and I guess he narrowly misses and then gets an ear. And that is a near miss. I don't know if this guy's ear stuck way out or not, but how you just get an ear on that kind of a swing is something else. So it's probably remarkable he didn't get a head. So he cuts off an ear. And what does Jesus do? He stoops down and picks it up and puts it back on it. In the craziest display of automatic healing and heaping fiery coals upon your enemy's head, hard to imagine what Malchus did for the rest of the night. If you've ever put Malchus, if you've tried to imagine being yourself, you're in this crowd of folks who's out here to arrest Jesus. Your ear gets cut off, and then he miraculously heals you. It kind of makes you think, did he participate in the rest of the night's festivities? And knowing his position, but again, it just further shows what? What does this instantaneous healing represent? What does it show us? Only God can do that. But what are these men? These men, do they care about that at all? No. 2 miracles, back to back. I don't know how you envision this. I envision this in the span of 30 seconds or a minute. He says his name, they all fall down. Peter cuts off his head, he attaches an ear. And they still take him away. They still lead him away. And I guess the other really miraculous part of all this, so the other really miraculous part of all this is that they still let Peter go. Think about that. That's the other part of this that seems unbelievable to me, is that Peter, swinging for someone's head, is still let go. Yeah, Fitzpatrick.
It's not in John. Jesus healed his ear. It's in Luke, and it doesn't say he reattached.
That's true. That's true. It does say he healed it, and I guess it would be just as odd if he just regrew an ear at the same. However, that obviously there's some kind of healing. You can imagine if he reattached or if he healed a new one. I don't know what it was. It must have been really odd, whatever the scenario was. But obviously the main takeaway is, despite of all that, despite Peter's actions, despite Jesus' words, they still let all of them go in this particular incident. And obviously that was a major concern for Jesus to fulfill what he wanted to have happen here. All right, let's keep moving. So we're going to look at, I'm going to put all of Peter's activities together because they're split into 2 different sections, interrupted by the testimony here with Annas and the trial that happens there. So we're going to read all of that together and then come back to Peter. So let's pick up in verse 12. So in verse 12, then the detachment of troops and captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. And then skipping down to verse 19, the high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple where the Jews always meet. And in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said. And when he said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, do you answer the high priest like that? Jesus answered him, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me? And then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Okay, so a couple notes on this. Who were Annas and Caiaphas? So, and this is where I've lost my notes. I don't have them, and this is where it would have really been helpful. So, I'm going to work a little bit from memory on this, so spare me a little bit on this. But during the intertestamental period time, particularly during the Ptolemies, so in between the testaments, there was a number of Greek rulers that particularly took over this section of Judea. And when the Ptolemies were in control, they were the Greek kingdom that ruled in Egypt, and they fought with the Seleucids who were in Syria. And they were constantly fighting over who would control Judea, all right? During this time frame, whichever Greek king was in charge would basically have them bid out the high priesthood, all right? So during that time frame, the idea of the high priesthood being of the right descendants of Aaron and that kind of thing, that all went out the window. And so the whole concept was, who can rule this well and bring us the most tax money? And that's how they decided who was going to be the high priest. And that went on and on during the Greek time frame. And so then it became closely connected, obviously, with an aristocratic, high governing, well-heeled, rich families that were in Jerusalem. And some of them were Aaronic in nature, but none of them were really truly of the correct line of Aaron. And that began hundreds of years, obviously, before this time. So you come down to this present time, and Annas, and this is where I'm going to go for a little bit from memory. I believe Annas was high priest from about 6 AD to 17 AD, I believe. Yeah. Annas was high priest from 6 to 17, and he was deposed from being high priest for whatever reason. We're not entirely sure. But being the old high priest, he carried immense weight. So the law didn't really have any idea of what to do with an ex-high priest. There wasn't really a concept of like the ex-high priest, okay? So, but he was a high priest, someone who was from a very powerful family, who was a part of the ruling class in Jerusalem. And so he was somewhat of a high priest emeritus, okay? So he was well thought of, a very powerful and influential individual. And after he was deposed in 17, in a very brief number of time, they went through about 4 or 5 high priests. And all of them, many of them were related to Annas. They were in his family. And then the 5th one that they landed on that stuck was this guy, Joseph ben Caiaphas, all right? And that was his son-in-law. So his first name really is Joseph. He's known as Caiaphas. And he was high priest from 17 all the way, I think, until about 34. So Caiaphas was the high priest during all the activity, all the years in which Jesus and John the Baptist would have been very active. Caiaphas would have been the high priest in that time frame. And so he was obviously a major figure during the work of both John the Baptist and Jesus himself. And obviously there's a reference here to him making the prophecy that one man would die for the people, which we referenced earlier in the book of John. Now, let's fast forward here briefly to verse 19 and the line of questioning. So note here, the high priest, so this is Annas, the high priest asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. And Annas' line of questioning seems to be revolving around 2 different things. One, he wants to ferret out insurrection. So previous to now, when there was somebody who rose up to be the Messiah, Gamaliel talks about this, right? So remember, Gamaliel says there's a guy, Theudius, and he rose up, and who did he have with him? Does anybody recall? Over in Acts, when Gamaliel says this, do you recall what he said, who was with him? It wasn't just Theudius out there in the desert. Who else was it? Yeah, there was a bunch of men out there with him, right? And that causes a big problem, right? Because he has a bunch of men with him. And so obviously, anytime you've got an armed resistance, the aristocracy in Jerusalem would be very interested, and the Romans would be very interested. So it seems that Annas is very interested in wanting to know about his disciples, and then also he wants him to self-incriminate, or at least it seems that Annas wants him to incriminate himself by saying something particularly against the temple or particularly against Rome, something that might really be able to nail him with. And so they're out to get him on his doctrine as well. But of course, Jesus' response to this indicates that I'm not going to give you anything. And in fact, Jesus has spoken so openly and so widely it would be entirely reasonable to think that inside this room where they are, I don't know who all is here, but it would be reasonable to suspect that there are people in this room, there are men in this room who know exactly what he's been said because they've been sitting there listening to Jesus say it for about a couple of years now. So it seems to me it's obviously not that Annas is not unfamiliar with what Jesus is claiming, but rather that he's trying to catch Jesus yet again, as they do over and over again, in saying something that might incriminate himself or something that they might be able to use against the Romans. And obviously, Jesus does no such thing and is struck on the mouth for his troubles. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about Peter briefly here as we move on through the class. So Peter, let's skip back up to verse 15. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside. Then the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to her, and who kept the door, and brought Peter in. Then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" And he said, "I am not." Now the servants and officers who made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood with them and warmed himself. Jump down to verse 25. Now Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. Therefore they said to him, "You're not also one of his disciples, are you?" And he denied it and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of those of him whose ear Peter cut off, said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" And Peter denied again, and immediately a rooster crowed. And obviously this was all foretold by Jesus in previous passages that we've talked about before. So a couple things about this. So there's a very interesting dynamic that's going on here. The immediate concern as they were leaving the garden was for the disciples' safety. So Jesus was immediately concerned that they all, and it was foretold that they would what? That they would scatter, that they would all flee from him. And they did ultimately. But what's really interesting is that two disciples, Peter and this other disciple, followed Jesus. So if you think about logistically what happened here, there was that whole incident in the garden, and Jesus leaves, and obviously the whole detachment of soldiers leaves with him. But presumably, at least two of the apostles follow that crowd all the way back down to Annas' house, which is the total opposite of what you would think any rational person would do. But such is their love and concern and devotion for Jesus, even in spite of what Peter had just done, and we'll come back to that in just a moment, that they with their feet follow him down there. And this other disciple, it's not clearly identified who it is, if it's John or if it's someone else. He apparently knew Annas or knew people in Annas' household, enough so that he felt comfortable enough to walk into the courtyard where all this is going down. And you talk about being in the heart of the lion's den. You were there with Jesus as a disciple, and now you're sitting in the courtyard where this is all going down. Peter, what does Peter do for a living? Does anybody recall? He's a fisherman. He probably has not spent a lot of time with well-heeled aristocrats in Jerusalem. He doesn't know these people, and they don't know him, other than, obviously, these people probably don't immediately recognize him as the one who struck Malchus. But this other disciple comes and tells the girl who's keeping the entrance to the courtyard, "Hey, he's with me, let him in." And so he comes in, which is an interesting place for both of them to be. So imagine now that you're one of these two disciples and you've been in this scenario, and now you're there out of devotion to Jesus. You want to see what's going to happen. But how might you be feeling? Terrified. I can't imagine, and I'm going to come back to Peter's state of mind here in just a second. Well, I've got it right now. Why do you think this happened to Peter? Why? So this series of events that happens with Peter is very interesting. Why did this happen to Peter? Why did he deny Jesus these 3 times? What are the reasons? Yeah. Right.
And then it just doesn't go down the way he thinks. And he's so scared to go that lives in the wilderness for 40 years. You know, and
Yeah.
yet God has to twist his arm to keep him go that. Peter was willing to cut the guy's head off. Look at you, Jesus said there's a sword there. It doesn't go down like Peter thinks it ought to go down. I think he doesn't know what to do.
I would agree with that I think that's a big component of it. One of the things that was said was Peter doesn't know how to act now that nothing's happened the way he thought it was going to happen. You know, he in his mind thought he was going to make this really brave display. The insurrection was going to be on at that point, you know, and he's going to be fighting. And Dad even brought up the point about Moses as it's mentioned in Acts chapter 7, where Stephen is retelling the story of Moses. And it says that Moses thought that the Israelites would understand that deliverance would be brought through Moses. You could probably say the exact same thing about Peter here. Peter thought they would understand that the deliverance was going to be brought by Jesus and his sword. And when it didn't happen that way, that obviously deflated him in a big way. What else? What are the other reasons that he denies Jesus in this? Put yourself in Peter's shoes. How would you feel? What would you be thinking? Okay, so self-preservation is a huge, huge part of this. He's afraid, and legitimately so. He just tried to kill a guy. And then a relative of this person is standing at the same fire. You talk about awkward situations. You ever tried to kill somebody and then stand at the fire with a relative? Me neither, but I can't imagine how awkward that must be. So there's undoubtedly a self-preservation angle of this. And he's known to be in Jesus' close circle. And in fact, the synoptics tell us what? They knew that he was in Jesus' close circle because of what? Does anybody recall? Yeah, you talk like him. You talk funny like one of those Galileans. So there's all these things. And then the other thing I was mentioning to you is that he's in an awkward and different position. You know, you ever been in like a really fancy place and you felt like you did not belong there at all? Or perhaps the complete opposite. So, in other words, he's in an awkward situation for a lot of different reasons. He's completely deflated. He doesn't understand what's going to happen next. He doesn't know what he's supposed to be. If you're Peter right now, you've got to be thinking, what am I supposed to be doing? Where do we go from here? He doesn't know how to process what happened this year. Yes. Yes, and so these are the what I would call the proximate causes. These are first order causes. But there's a deeper thing going on here. And I think what it's really preparing Peter for is what we're going to come back around to in John chapter 21. All this time, Peter has been telling Jesus all the things he's prepared to do for Jesus. But what Jesus clarifies for Peter is that, Peter, I know you better than you know you. I know exactly what you need. What you need is to be in this situation. What you need, Peter, is to stumble so you can come back stronger and better than you would have been otherwise. And really, I think that's one of the things that is an emphasis for all of us, is that we think we know ourselves so well. Jesus knew Peter better than Peter knew Peter. Jesus knew what Peter needed more than Peter knew what he needed. Peter put himself in this situation. Peter never would have been in this situation if he had, like the other 10 disciples, the other 9 disciples hightailed and ran. He's only in this position because he chose to be where he's at. But he needed this to come back around to something very important that's going to be said to him by Jesus in chapter 21. Yeah. That's yeah. That's exactly right. I think it's in this whole idea. It's It's easier to have faith when there's a plan. But when we don't know God's plan, that's when it's really difficult, isn't it? When you have no idea how this is going to turn out or what you're even supposed to be doing is when it's the most difficult. And that's exactly the place that I think Peter finds himself in. Yeah, Bobby.
Could be a possibility that you're under pressure. And
Yeah.
a young girl at the door.
Yeah.
You are not one of his disciples. Gave him an easy.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm not one.
That's right, and that is interesting. Bobby points out that, and it's not just the young girl at the door, it's actually every single one. The way John writes these, John writes them all in the negative sense. So everybody says, hey, you're not that person, and makes it so much easier to say, oh no, yeah, you're right, I'm not that person. It kind of eases them into it, doesn't it? Somebody else I read had pointed out the exact same thing about the way this is phrased. So we say all that obviously to say many of the things that applies to Peter, we can find ourselves in so many of the exact same situations for the exact same reasons. And as much as I love to kind of make fun of Peter for so many different, because he's just an easy target, but we just find ourselves so often in the exact same kinds of situations. We feel awkward. We feel afraid. We feel a million different, we don't know what God's plan is. We don't know how this is supposed to work out for any of us. And it makes things very, very difficult. I don't have time to completely dive into these two passages here, but obviously these two passages, one is from Matthew chapter 10:32, which is simply the passage that mentions, he that confesses me before men, I will confess him before my Father. He that denies me before men, I will deny before my Father. And then Hebrews chapter 2, 10 through 12 is the reference where the Hebrew writer over there is making reference to Jesus will declare those who are his brethren before the Father himself. So Jesus is willing to go into the presence of God and declare sinners like us before his Father. And so how much more we should be able and willing to declare him before us. But obviously, Peter changes around entirely here. And before we're running quickly out of time, so I want to take a look at the interaction here with Pilate. In verse 28, then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early in the morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Pilate then went out to them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? They answered and said to him, if he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you. Then Pilate said to them, you take him and judge him according to your law. Therefore the Jews said to him, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. Then the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus, and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus answered him, are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you concerning me? Pilate answered, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. Pilate therefore said to him, are you a king then? Jesus answered, you say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Pilate said to him, what is truth? And when he said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no fault in him at all. We're not going to have time to finish all this. And I want to come, and we'll start again Sunday with this concept, with the idea that Pilate mentions here right at the very end. Just as a brief aside here before we end the class. So Pilate is a Roman prefect that was appointed in 26 by the Caesar Tiberius and was disposed in 37. Many considered him weak and ineffectual, and there was regular outbreaks of violence at his time. He particularly was in and this will come back around in chapter 19. In chapter 19, there's the accusation, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. That carries particularly barb at this time. He was his benefactor in Rome was this Roman prefect, the Praetorian Guard's captain named Sejanus. Sejanus had just been killed for treason in AD 31, which left Pilate in a very precarious position with the Romans in 31 when this trial occurs with Jesus. And so we're going to come back around and talk about some of this, and then we'll get in, obviously, to the resurrection proper, chapter 19 next time. Thank you all very much.